In May 2021, in Deaf Smith County, Texas, 35-year-old farmer Mara Bell stood beside a wire gate and watched 200 ostriches pour into her dying pasture. The birds were taller than her tractor hood, fast enough to make grown men step backward, and loud enough to turn heads half a mile away. Nobody in the county understood why she had brought them there. Mara had not rescued them because she loved ostriches. She had rescued them because the alternative was worse. The birds belonged to a bankrupt breeder outside Amarillo. His feed bills had swallowed the operation, and the county had been told the flock would be sold by the end of the week. Mara bought the entire group for less than the price of a used hay baler, using the last credit available against her farm. When her neighbor, Dale Mercer, saw the first truck arrive, he laughed so hard he had to lean against his fence. "You're putting 200 ostriches on 40 acres?" Mara only tightened the gate chain. Her farm had 48 acres, an aging red brick farmhouse, a dry irrigation pond, and 70 acres of debt attached to land she no longer owned. 3 months earlier, the bank had given her until October to make the first payment. Her cotton crop had failed. Her sorghum had barely broken even. The old irrigation well was pumping brown water. And now she had 200 birds eating what little grass remained. By sunset, half the county knew about them. By morning, people were driving slowly past Mara's road just to stare. At the feed store, men joked that she had opened a zoo. At the diner, somebody called her the Ostrich Lady. Mara heard all of it. She said nothing. Every morning before sunrise, she walked the fence line in mud-caked boots, carrying a wrench, a notebook, and a dented blue water bucket. She checked every bird. She counted them twice. 200. Always 200. On the fourth morning, she noticed something strange. The ostriches were not spreading across the pasture. They were gathering along the northern fence. All 200. Mara stopped walking. Beyond that fence was the driest section of her property, a strip of hard caliche soil where nothing had grown since she was a child. The grass was gray. The ground was cracked. Even weeds struggled. Yet the ostriches kept pressing toward it. They pecked at the dirt. Then they kicked it. Then they moved 3 yards east and did it again. Mara watched for nearly 20 minutes. She had seen animals act strangely before storms. She had seen cattle crowd around a broken water pipe. But this was different. That afternoon, the bank's agricultural inspector arrived in a white pickup. His name was Curtis Harlan, 58, and he had spent 30 years telling farmers what their land could not do. He looked at the birds. Then at Mara. Then back at the birds. "You understand those things can eat you out of a pasture?" "They haven't." "They will." Mara glanced toward the northern fence. "They're not eating the pasture." Curtis followed her eyes. The ostriches were still digging. He laughed once. That laugh stayed with Mara. Not because it hurt. Because it made her certain he had not seen what she had seen. That evening, Mara climbed into the cab of her 1967 Ford 8N, the tractor her grandfather had bought used in 1974 after selling his last herd of cattle. The starter complained twice before the engine caught. She drove slowly toward the northern fence. The ostriches followed. 200 long necks rose behind her like a moving field of brown grass. Then one bird stopped. It lowered its head. It struck the ground 3 times. Mara shut off the tractor. For a few seconds, everything went quiet. Then she heard it. Not a bird. Not wind. Water. A faint, hollow rushing sound came from beneath the cracked ground. Mara climbed down. She pressed her palm against the soil. It was cool. She looked at the 200 ostriches. For the first time since inheriting the farm, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Possibility. But she did not know what was buried under that field. And by the next morning, the county would know too. At dawn, Mara returned with a shovel. She did not tell Curtis. She did not tell Dale. She did not call the bank. She walked to the place where the ostrich had struck the earth and dug 6 inches. The shovel hit something hard. Metal. She cleared the dirt with her fingers and found an old green irrigation pipe, crushed nearly flat but still cold beneath the soil. Her grandfather had once mentioned an abandoned north line, but Mara had assumed it had been removed decades earlier. She dug farther. The pipe continued toward the dead field. That explained the birds gathering there. Maybe. But when Mara stood and looked across the pasture, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The ostriches were not following the pipe. They were following a line beside it. And that line led straight toward the old irrigation pond. The pond had been empty for 7 years. Mara stared at the birds until one of them gave a deep, rolling call. Then another answered. Then all 200 turned at once. They began walking north. Mara followed. Whatever they had found, they were not finished showing her. She reached beneath the broken concrete and pulled out a rusted brass valve handle wrapped in faded red cloth. Mara recognized the cloth immediately. It had belonged to her grandfather. She stood slowly. The ostriches watched her. For the first time, Mara wondered whether the farm had not been dying naturally at all. Behind her, the flock suddenly erupted into motion. 200 birds ran toward the far fence. Mara turned. One section of ground was sinking. Then the earth opened, and something blue appeared beneath the collapsing dirt. Suddenly, Mara took one step toward the collapsing ground. Then another. The blue object was not a barrel. It was a length of thick steel pipe, painted the same faded blue her grandfather had used on the old irrigation equipment. She knelt beside the opening. The earth had fallen away enough to expose nearly 3 feet of buried pipe. But the pipe was not empty. Water was running beneath it. Mara could hear the pressure now. A low vibration traveled through the metal and into her fingertips. She stood quickly. The ostriches had stopped running. Every bird was facing her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then one of the largest males lowered its head and struck the ground beside the pipe. Once, twice, 3 times. Mara looked toward the old irrigation pond. The pond sat nearly 200 yards away, surrounded by dead grass and cracked earth. She suddenly understood what her grandfather had meant years earlier when he told her, "Water remembers where it's been." She had thought it was something old farmers said when they wanted to sound wise. Now she wasn't so sure. Mara returned to the farmhouse and pulled a dusty county survey map from a drawer. The map was dated 1969. Her grandfather's handwriting covered the edges. She spread it across the kitchen table. There was the farmhouse, the barn, the original well, and beneath the northern field, a series of thin blue lines. Mara followed them with her finger. They formed an underground irrigation network that connected the old well to the pond. But there was something strange. One line did not end at the pond. It continued beneath the road, then beyond her property, then toward an abandoned drainage basin nearly half a mile away. Mara stared at it. Someone had deliberately buried an irrigation line under the county road. Why? She barely had time to wonder. A truck pulled into the driveway. Curtis Harlan stepped out. This time, he wasn't laughing. He carried a clipboard and wore the same gray hat he had worn during the inspection. "The bank wants another look at the property." Mara folded the map. "They already inspected it. They want confirmation before foreclosure proceedings." Her hands tightened around the paper. "When?" "Friday." It was Tuesday. 3 days. Curtis glanced toward the flock. "You still have all 200? "Yes." "You need to get rid of them." Mara looked at him. "Why?" "Because your livestock liability has already become an issue." "They're not livestock." Curtis frowned. "Then what are they?" Mara looked through the window. The birds were standing in a long line beside the northern fence. "They're telling me something." Curtis stared at her for a moment. Then he shook his head. "That sentence is exactly why the bank is worried." He left before Mara could answer. That evening, a storm formed west of Amarillo. It wasn't supposed to reach her farm. The forecast called for scattered rain, perhaps half an inch. Mara didn't trust the forecast. She had lived on the plains long enough to know that clouds could change their minds. She walked outside after dark. The ostriches were restless. Their heads were raised. Their feathers moved in the wind. Then something strange happened. Every bird turned toward the north. Mara followed their gaze. Lightning flashed beyond the horizon. A few seconds later, thunder rolled across the flat land. The storm was still miles away. But the ostriches began moving. Not toward shelter. Toward the dry field. Mara grabbed her flashlight. She followed them. The first birds reached the exposed pipe. Then they stopped. Mara heard water again. Stronger this time. She crouched beside the pipe and pressed her ear against it. A deep rushing sound filled her head. The old system was alive. The question was why. She returned to the farmhouse and opened her grandfather's old mechanic's cabinet. Behind a box of rusted spark plugs, she found a handwritten notebook. Most pages contained tractor repairs, engine measurements, and irrigation notes. Then she found one sentence underlined twice. Never close the north gate completely. Mara read it again. North gate. She knew the farm had once had a water control gate. But nobody had seen it in decades. She grabbed her boots. By midnight, she was back in the field. The ostriches were scattered around a patch of grass near the pond. Mara dug. 5 inches. 10. 15. Her shovel struck concrete. She cleared the dirt. A rectangular concrete box appeared beneath the ground. Inside it was an iron wheel. The wheel was frozen with rust. Mara wrapped both hands around it. It didn't move. She pulled harder. Nothing. Then one of the ostriches walked over. It lowered its enormous body and kicked the ground directly beside the wheel. The vibration shook loose a layer of dirt. Mara noticed a narrow opening. Air was moving through it. She leaned closer. Cold air touched her face. There was a tunnel underneath. She sat back. For years, everyone had blamed drought for the farm's decline. But what if the drought wasn't the whole story? What if water had been trapped beneath her property? What if the old irrigation network had been blocked? And what if the ostriches had found the place where it could still breathe? Mara returned the next morning with a Ford 8N. The tractor had belonged to her grandfather longer than she had been alive. Its paint was faded. Its seat was cracked. Its rear tires were patched. But the engine still pulled like an animal that refused to die. She attached an old rear blade and slowly scraped away the soil around the concrete box. For 3 hours, she worked. The ostriches followed. Every time the blade uncovered something unusual, they gathered around it. At noon, Mara uncovered a second pipe. Then a third. The pipes formed a network beneath the pasture. She stopped the tractor. This wasn't an abandoned line. It was an entire underground drainage system. And it had been deliberately shut down. Mara wiped sweat from her forehead. Her grandfather hadn't failed to maintain the farm. Someone had changed the water system. She looked toward the county road. That was when she noticed fresh tire tracks. Someone had been there during the night. Mara followed the tracks to the northern fence. They stopped beside the same buried pipe. The tire marks were too fresh to be old. She crouched and touched them. Then she heard an engine. A white county pickup appeared beyond the fence. Curtis stepped out. But he wasn't alone. A man in a dark jacket climbed from the passenger side. Mara recognized him immediately. Daniel Voss, the regional manager from the bank. He looked across the field. Then toward the exposed irrigation system. His expression changed. Not confusion. Recognition. Mara noticed it. "You know what this is," she said. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the ostriches. 200 birds had gathered behind Mara. Daniel took one step backward. Then another. Finally he said something so quietly that Mara almost missed it. "Your grandfather was supposed to destroy that line." Mara stared at him. "Why?" Daniel looked toward the old pond. Because beneath that dead pond was something the bank had been searching for 27 years. And suddenly Mara understood why they were so desperate to take her farm. The land wasn't worthless. It was hiding something. Something that had been there long before she inherited it. And the ostriches had just led her straight to it. Mara did not move. Neither did Daniel Voss. Between them stood 200 ostriches, their long shadows stretching across the dead pasture. The wind had picked up. Dust moved over the cracked ground in thin sheets. Mara looked at Daniel. What was my grandfather supposed to destroy? Daniel glanced toward Curtis. Curtis looked away. That told Mara enough. You both knew. Daniel finally stepped closer to the fence. Your grandfather had an agreement with the county. What agreement? He was told to shut the northern water system after the drainage district changed. Why? Daniel hesitated. Because it interfered with a proposed water project. Mara looked toward the dry pond. And nobody told me? You inherited the property with the understanding that the system was inactive. Mara almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because she had spent 3 years believing she was simply a bad farmer. She had blamed herself for every failed crop. Every dead plant. Every month she couldn't make the payment. But beneath her fields was a water system somebody had intentionally abandoned. She looked at the exposed pipe. How long has it been blocked? Daniel didn't answer. Curtis did. 27 years. Mara turned toward him. And you knew? Curtis lowered his eyes. I knew there was an old drainage easement. That isn't what I asked. Curtis swallowed. Yes. The word hung in the air. Mara walked toward the concrete control box. She placed her hand on the rusted wheel. Then she looked back at the men. What happens if I open it? Daniel's face changed. Don't. That was the first honest answer he had given her. Mara turned the wheel. It didn't move. She tried again. Nothing. Then she noticed something on the ground. A narrow trail of disturbed dirt ran from the concrete box toward the dry pond. The ostriches had made it. They had been digging there for days. Mara followed the trail. The birds followed her. She reached the edge of the pond and stopped. The ground was covered with thousands of tiny cracks. But beneath one section, the soil was darker. Moist. She dropped to her knees. She dug with her hands. At 6 inches, the dirt became cool. At 12 inches, it was damp. At 18, water seeped into the hole. Mara stared. The pond wasn't dry. It was sitting above a trapped underground water channel. The ostriches had been finding it. That was why they kept returning. Their long legs were not simply kicking dirt. They were opening tiny vents in the soil above the buried system. Mara remembered something her grandfather used to say about birds. They notice the ground before we do. At the time, she had assumed he meant storms. Now she understood. The ostriches were reading the landscape. They were finding moisture. And they had been leading her toward it since the first morning. The next day, Mara called a local agricultural extension specialist. Dr. Evelyn Harper arrived before noon. She walked the field quietly. She examined the soil. She checked the old pipes. Then she knelt beside the pond. Your water table is higher than you think. Mara stared at her. How much higher? Enough that your root zone may have been sitting above usable moisture for years. Evelyn explained it simply. Soil isn't just dirt. It has layers. Water moves through those layers according to pressure, texture, and gravity. A buried drainage line can redirect that water. If a gate closes, water can collect underground instead of reaching the surface. Plants may look drought-stressed even when moisture is only a few feet below their roots. Mara looked across her dead pasture. The problem wasn't simply that the farm had no water. The problem was that the water had nowhere to go. And somebody had blocked its path. That afternoon, the county arrived. So did the bank. So did half the people who had laughed at Mara's ostriches. Someone had called the local newspaper. By sunset, there were trucks parked along the road. The headline appeared online before dark. Local farmer bets her land on 200 ostriches. People came to watch. Mara hated the attention. She wanted to work. But there was no hiding now. The county inspector demanded that she remove the birds. They are creating an unsafe agricultural environment. Mara pointed toward the field. They're the only reason we found the water. Nobody laughed this time. Then an ostrich walked directly behind the inspector. The man turned. The bird stared at him. He took one careful step forward. The ostrich took one step forward too. The crowd laughed. Even Mara smiled. But the laughter stopped when the ground cracked. A section of the dry pond suddenly collapsed. Dust rose into the air. Then water appeared. Not a puddle. A sheet. Clear water pushed through the broken earth and spread across the bottom of the pond. The crowd went silent. Mara stood frozen. The ostriches moved first. All 200 birds ran toward the water. Their feet struck the ground like hundreds of hammers. They surrounded the emerging stream. For a moment, Mara could not see anything except birds. Brown feathers. Long necks. Dust. Water. Then the sunlight broke through the clouds. The scene looked impossible. 200 ostriches stood around a pond that everyone had declared dead. Mara felt tears rise in her eyes. Not because the farm was saved. It wasn't. Not yet. But because she finally knew she had not imagined the signs. The birds had been telling her. People saw 200 unwanted animals. Mara saw a warning system. A living map of the land. The bank manager stepped forward. This doesn't change the loan. Mara turned. No. He looked surprised. She pointed toward the water. But it changes the value of the property. Daniel's face tightened. He knew it too. The old water system could restore the farm. And if the bank had known about it before the foreclosure, they had been preparing to acquire the property at a fraction of its potential value. Mara had one problem left. The irrigation system was still blocked, and reopening it could flood her neighbors' fields. She needed permission. The county refused. So Mara did what she had always done. She went back to work. She brought out the old Ford 8N. She attached the rear blade. She repaired the concrete gate. She replaced the rusted valve stem. She worked until her hands were bleeding. The ostriches followed her every day. They stayed near the machinery. They watched the pipes. They moved whenever water shifted beneath the ground. Then, on the 6th evening, Mara finally turned the wheel. It moved. 1 inch. Then another. A deep vibration rolled beneath the field. The ostriches suddenly ran. All 200. Straight toward the eastern pasture. Mara stopped. Water was moving beneath her boots. The old system had opened. But instead of flowing toward the pond, the water was rushing east. Toward the lowest part of the farm. Toward the field she had planted with nothing but hope. Mara climbed onto the tractor. She followed the birds. And as the sun disappeared, the first green shoots began pushing through the soil. Mara stopped the tractor. She stared. The field was not dead. It had been waiting. But what happened next would determine whether the farm survived. By sunrise, the eastern field looked different. Not green. Not yet. But alive. Moisture had reached the upper soil layer overnight, darkening long strips between the rows. Mara walked through the field before breakfast, pressing her fingers into the ground. The soil held together. It was no longer powder. She looked toward the pasture. The ostriches were already awake. 200 of them stood along the fence, watching her. Mara had stopped thinking of them as livestock. They had become her early warning system. Whenever they gathered near one section of ground, she checked it. Whenever they moved away from another, she investigated. Their behavior became a map. And the map revealed something else. The birds were not damaging the pasture as badly as everyone had predicted. They were eating weeds, disturbing compacted patches, and leaving behind manure that returned organic matter to the soil. Mara began rotating them through selected areas. She did not let them roam everywhere. She watched. She adjusted. She learned. Within weeks, the pasture changed. The birds were not saving the farm by some miracle. They were helping Mara manage it differently. The real breakthrough came in July. A hot wind arrived from the west. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees. The county warned farmers to prepare for severe drought conditions. Mara had already prepared. She had repaired the old irrigation network. She had divided the fields into smaller sections. She had planted drought-tolerant sorghum and forage crops suited to the high plains. and she had installed a simple moisture monitoring system beside the root zones. For the first time in years, she was not guessing. She was watching. The ostriches still watched too. Then came the storm. It arrived without warning. A violent summer thunderstorm rolled over Deaf Smith County. Rain hit the farm hard. Within minutes, the eastern field began flooding. Mara ran outside. The old drainage system was carrying water toward the pond, exactly as her grandfather had designed it. But one section was blocked. Mara climbed onto the Ford 8N. She drove through the rain. The tractor slipped twice. She stopped beside the drainage gate. Mud covered the wheels. The water was rising. She jumped down. Her boots disappeared ankle-deep. She opened the gate manually. Water roared through the channel. Behind her, the ostriches began moving. All 200. They ran along the drainage line. Mara watched them. They were not running randomly. They were following the water. The flock stopped at the southern edge of the field. One bird kicked at the ground. Mara looked down. A buried culvert was blocked with roots and silt. She grabbed a shovel. For nearly an hour, she cleared it. Then the water broke through. The field drained. The crop survived. That night, Mara sat on the porch listening to rain strike the tin roof. Her grandfather's old notebook rested beside her. She opened it to the page she had found weeks earlier. Never close the north gate completely. Below it was another sentence she had missed. Water always tells you where the farm wants to live. Mara closed the notebook. She finally understood. The farm had not needed somebody to force it back into production. It needed someone willing to listen. The bank changed its position in August. Daniel Voss returned to the farm. This time, he came alone. He stood beside the fence for several minutes. Then he removed his hat. "I was wrong." Mara said nothing. Daniel looked across the green pasture. "You weren't throwing money away." Mara looked at the ostriches. "No." Daniel nodded. He handed her a folder. The foreclosure had been suspended. The bank had agreed to restructure the loan. Not because they felt sorry for her. Because the farm was producing again. Mara signed nothing that day. She read every page first. Then she hired an attorney. That was another lesson she learned. Understanding the land was not enough. Sometimes you had to understand the people trying to take it. By October, Mara harvested her first successful forage crop in years. It wasn't enormous. It wasn't a miracle harvest. But it paid the feed bill. Then the feed bill was paid. Then the tractor repair. Then part of the loan. The ostriches had become famous. Visitors came from neighboring counties. A photographer arrived from Lubbock. A livestock specialist offered Mara money for breeding rights. She refused the first offer. Then the second. Finally, she realized the birds could become another income stream without destroying the farm. She built a controlled ostrich operation around the flock. She sold eggs. She sold feathers. She eventually sold a limited number of birds to licensed breeders. But she kept the original 200. They remained on the farm. 5 years later, the old pasture was almost unrecognizable. The northern field was green. The pond held water. The irrigation system worked. The farm no longer depended on one crop. Mara had planted sorghum, forage grasses, sunflowers, and a small orchard near the eastern drainage channel. The ostriches moved through designated paddocks. And every morning, Mara still walked the fence. Curtis Harlan came once a year. He no longer arrived with a clipboard. He arrived with coffee. The first time he came after the farm recovered, he stood beside Mara and watched the flock. "I owe you an apology." Mara looked at him. "For what?" "For laughing." She smiled slightly. "You weren't the only one." Curtis looked at the birds. "I should have paid attention." Mara nodded. That was all. There was no speech. There didn't need to be. 10 years after the first ostrich truck arrived, Mara's farm had become a small agricultural teaching operation. Young farmers visited to study soil moisture management. Extension agents used the property as an example of adaptive water use. The old Ford 8N still worked. Its paint had faded further. Its engine leaked a little oil. But Mara refused to replace it. The tractor had helped uncover the old water system. And she believed machines, like people, deserved to finish the work they started. One afternoon, a school bus stopped at the gate. Children climbed out. Mara led them toward the ostrich pasture. A little girl stared at the birds. "Did you know they would save your farm?" Mara looked across the field. "No." "Then why did you keep them?" Mara thought about the first morning. The laughter. The dead pasture. The birds pressing toward the northern fence. She answered quietly, "I didn't know what they were telling me." The girl looked confused. Mara smiled. "I just knew I should listen." The children walked toward the fence. The ostriches gathered. One bird stretched its neck over the gate. The little girl stepped back, then laughed. Mara watched them. Behind her stood the farmhouse. Beyond it were green fields. The old pond reflected the afternoon sky. And beneath the soil, the water continued moving through the system her grandfather had built. The farm had not been saved by money. It had not been saved by the bank. It had not been saved by a government program. It had been saved because one farmer noticed something everyone else dismissed. People saw 200 ostriches. Mara saw 200 questions. And eventually, those questions led her back to the water. That evening, she walked alone through the pasture. The ostriches followed at a distance. The sun dropped behind the Texas horizon. Dust floated above the grass. The pond caught the last orange light. Then the flock stopped. All 200 birds stood together. For a moment, Mara thought they were watching the northern fence again. But this time there was nothing wrong. No broken pipe. No hidden water. No collapsing earth. Just a quiet field. Mara rested one hand against the old fence post. She listened. The wind moved through the grass. The pond rippled. The birds settled. And somewhere beneath the soil, water kept moving toward the roots. The dying farm was alive again. The ostriches had never needed to become something else. Mara had simply learned what they were trying to tell her. Years earlier, everyone had laughed when she rescued 200 ostriches. Now, nobody laughed. They came to see the birds. But they stayed to see the farm. And every morning, before the first visitor arrived, Mara opened the gate herself. 200 ostriches stepped into the golden pasture. The old Ford 8N sat silent beside the barn. The pond reflected the pale morning sky. And the first sunlight touched the grass. For once, nothing needed fixing. The farm was simply breathing.